My son called me the night before his wedding. His voice sounded cold, rehearsed. "Mom," he said quietly, "please don't come tomorrow." At first I thought he was joking. I had spent months helping pay for that wedding. I had ironed my navy dress that very morning, but then he added the sentence that shattered something inside me forever. "It'll just make things easier for everyone." Everyone, not me, not his own mother. So I stayed home in my little Savannah kitchen while my son married a woman who wanted me erased. And hours later, at that beautiful Charleston wedding, they discovered the secret I had kept for years. And suddenly my absence became the center of the entire ceremony. If you were in my place, would you have still gone to the wedding? Or stayed home like I did? Tell me honestly in the comments. And before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. People think heartbreak arrives all at once, like a slammed door, a funeral call, divorce papers on the kitchen counter. But in my experience, heartbreak is quieter than that. It happens slowly over years in tiny invisible moments you don't notice until one day you wake up and realize someone you love no longer sees you the same way. My name is Andrea Patterson. I'm 67 years old, and until recently I believe my son Ethan and I were the kind of family people envied. Not because we were wealthy, not because life had been easy, but because we had survived hard things together. I still live in the same Savannah house Ethan grew up in. The white two-story home with the creaky porch swing Daniel installed 25 years ago. Some evenings, when the Georgia heat softens and the cicadas start singing, I still sit out there with sweet tea and imagine I can hear my husband laughing in the backyard again. Daniel passed away 8 years ago from pancreatic cancer. Sometimes it still feels impossible to say that sentence out loud. He had been the steady center of our family, the kind of man who remembered anniversaries, fixed leaking sinks at midnight, and danced barefoot in the kitchen when old jazz songs played on the radio. When he died, Ethan was 31 years old and trying to build his architecture career in Atlanta. I remember watching my son at the funeral standing stiff in a black suit beside his father's casket, trying so hard not to cry that his jaw shook. That was the moment I promised myself something. No matter how broken I felt, I would never let Ethan carry the burden of losing both parents at once, so I became stronger than I really was. I helped him with graduate school loans after Daniel passed. I dipped into savings when Ethan lost his first apartment during a rough patch early in his career. I mailed him homemade meals when he worked 80-hour weeks at the firm. Every Sunday, even after he moved back to Savannah, he came over for dinner. Those Sundays became sacred to me. Roast chicken, cornbread, peach cobbler if I had the energy. Ethan would loosen his tie, sit at the kitchen counter, and tell me about impossible clients and exhausting deadlines while I pretended not to notice how tired he looked. Dad would have loved this project, he once told me while showing me blueprints for a waterfront hotel. I smiled and touched his shoulder. "Your father would have bragged about you to strangers at the grocery store." Ethan laughed at that because it was true. Daniel had adored him. And for a long time, I truly believed Ethan adored me too. Then he met Brittany Sinclair. The first time I saw her was at a charity gala downtown. Ethan brought her over looking nervous in a way I hadn't seen since high school. "Mom," he said, "this is Brittany." She was beautiful, elegant, in a polished magazine cover kind of way. Long blonde hair, diamond earrings, posture so perfect it almost didn't look natural. But it wasn't her beauty that unsettled me. It was how carefully she studied people, like she was measuring what they could offer her. Still, I welcomed her warmly. I hugged her, told her any woman who could make my son smile like that already had my approval. She smiled politely. "Ethan talks about you all the time," she said. The words sounded kind enough, but her eyes stayed cold. At first, I ignored the feeling in my stomach. I told myself I was being protective. Mothers sometimes struggle when another woman becomes important to their son. I wanted to be fair, so I tried. Lord, I tried. I invited Brittany to lunch, bought her birthday gifts, asked questions about her work in luxury event marketing, complimented her dresses even when I knew they probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment years ago. But every interaction with her felt strangely formal, like she was tolerating me instead of knowing me. And slowly, almost invisibly, things between Ethan and me began to change. Sunday dinners became every other week. Then once a month. Then, sorry, Mom, we already have plans. Ethan stopped calling just to talk. Sometimes I'd send a text in the morning and not hear back until midnight. One afternoon, I drove to Atlanta to surprise him at a building showcase his firm hosted. I stood near the back of the room, proudly watching him present designs to investors. He looked so confident, so successful. My heart nearly burst seeing him there. But when Ethan spotted me in the crowd, something flashed across his face. Not happiness, panic. After the presentation, he hugged me quickly and whispered, "Mom, you should have told me you were coming." I laughed awkwardly. "I wanted to surprise you." Brittany appeared beside him seconds later in a cream-colored dress, so expensive I was afraid to stand too close to it. Her smile tightened when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "Andrea's here. Not Andrea, not Mrs. Patterson. Andrea's here." Like I was unexpected weather. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to convince myself I imagined the embarrassment on Ethan's face. But deep down, something had already started breaking. About 6 months later, Ethan proposed to Brittany during a weekend trip to Napa Valley. He called me afterwards, sounding happier than I'd heard him in years. She said, "Yes, Mom." I cried right there in my kitchen. I truly believed things would get better after that. Families grow, I told myself. Love stretches. But instead, it felt like I was slowly disappearing from my own son's life. Wedding planning started almost immediately. At first, Ethan included me in everything. Venue tours, cake tastings, guest lists. Then Brittany took over. Suddenly, decisions were already made before I heard about them. The wedding moved from Savannah to Charleston because Brittany wanted something more elevated. The flowers changed because my choices looked too traditional. Even the music shifted from Southern jazz to a string quartet Brittany insisted sounded classier. Every time I offered an opinion, Ethan grew strangely tense. "It's not a big deal, Mom," or "Brittany just has a vision." A vision. I started hearing that word constantly. One evening I overheard Brittany talking on speakerphone while Ethan stepped outside to take another call. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was in the kitchen bringing tea. But then I heard her laugh softly and say, "This wedding needs sophistication. We can't make it look small town." Something inside me froze, because I suddenly understood what she meant. Not the wedding. Me. That night after they left, I sat alone at my dining table staring at the untouched teacups. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my son was becoming ashamed of where he came from, ashamed of me. And somehow, I already knew the worst was still coming. The first time Brittany openly embarrassed me, she smiled while doing it. That was what made it hurt so much. Cruel people are easier to defend yourself against when they're obvious. But Brittany had mastered the art of sounding polite while quietly making you feel small. About 4 months before the wedding, she invited me to Charleston to tour the new venue she had chosen, the Sinclair Cove Resort, she announced proudly over the phone. "It's absolutely stunning." I had suggested several beautiful historic venues in Savannah places filled with Southern charm and family warmth, but Brittany dismissed every single one. Too dated, too rustic, too local. Apparently local was now an insult. Still, I drove the 2 hours to Charleston because I wanted to support Ethan. That's what mothers do. We swallow discomfort for the people we love. The resort truly was beautiful. Oceanfront property, white marble floors, massive chandeliers hanging over a ballroom that overlooked the water. Everything gleamed with expensive perfection. Brittany stood in the center of it all, like a queen inspecting her kingdom. "Isn't this incredible?" she asked. "It's lovely," I admitted honestly. But it didn't feel like Ethan. My son used to love simple things. Backyard cookouts, fishing with his father, jazz music drifting through open windows. This place felt cold, like something built for photographs instead of memories. Brittany spent nearly an hour discussing imported linen, celebrity chefs, and designer floral arrangements while I followed quietly behind her. At one point, Ethan squeezed my shoulder gently. "You okay, Mom?" I forced a smile. "Of course." But I noticed how distracted he seemed, how quickly his attention snapped back toward Brittany every time she spoke, like he was afraid to disappoint her. Then came the tasting lunch. We sat with the event coordinator in a private dining room overlooking the ocean. Brittany ordered champagne for everyone before I could even ask for water. The coordinator turned toward me politely. And what kind of atmosphere are you envisioning for the rehearsal dinner, Mrs. Patterson? Before I could answer, Brittany laughed softly. Oh, Andrea won't really be involved in that part. The woman blinked awkwardly. I looked at Ethan. He immediately focused on his menu. Brittany continued smiling. We're trying to keep everything very elegant and modern. Very elegant. I suddenly became deeply aware of my southern accent, of my pearl earrings, of the fact I still carried reading glasses in my purse attached to a little gold chain Daniel once bought me on vacation. For the first time in years, I felt unsophisticated, old, embarrassing. The lunch dragged on painfully after that. Every suggestion I made floated into silence before Brittany redirected the conversation elsewhere. When I mentioned family recipes for the rehearsal dinner, Brittany said, "Oh, we're avoiding anything too heavy or traditional." When I complimented the live jazz band performing outside near the patio, Brittany wrinkled her nose. I think jazz can feel a little dated. Dated. Everything about me suddenly seemed dated. By the end of the afternoon, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with age. As we walked toward the valet stand, Ethan finally noticed my silence. "Mom." "I'm fine," I said automatically. "You seem upset." Before I could answer, Brittany slipped her arm through his. "Babe, don't start overthinking things again." Again. That word lingered in my chest all the way home. A week later, I mailed Ethan a check to help cover additional wedding costs. I never mentioned it to Brittany. Truthfully, I suspected she already assumed my contribution was insignificant compared to her family's money, but I knew Ethan was quietly struggling financially. Architecture paid well eventually, but not at the level Brittany liked to spend. Sometimes I wondered whether Ethan even realized how much pressure he was under, trying to keep up with her world. The check was for $40,000, a portion of Daniel's investment dividends. 3 days later, Ethan called me sounding emotional. "Mom, this is too much. It's for your future," I told him gently. "You've already done enough." I almost cried hearing that because it sounded like my son again. Not Brittany's polished version of him, just Ethan. For a few minutes, we laughed together the way we used to. He told me about a difficult client. I told him Claire Monroe had accidentally backed her car into her own mailbox again. I felt hopeful afterward. Maybe this tension was temporary. Maybe wedding stress was changing everyone. But then Brittany started pulling Ethan further away. The calls became shorter. The visits became rare. One Sunday, I cooked dinner anyway, even though Ethan had canceled twice already. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, honey carrots. I kept glancing at the clock while the food grew cold. At 7:30, my phone buzzed. "Sorry, Mom. Something came up. No explanation, no call, just a text." I sat alone at the dining table staring at 3 untouched plates because I still cooked as if my family existed the way it used to. That night, Claire came over carrying wine and grocery store cheesecake. Claire Monroe had been my best friend for over 40 years, divorced twice, brutally honest, and incapable of sugarcoating anything. She took one look at the untouched food and sighed. He canceled again. I nodded. Claire opened the wine without asking permission. "I'm going to say something you won't like. That's never stopped you before." She pointed her fork at me. "That girl doesn't want a family, Andrea. She wants status." I immediately defended Brittany. "She loves Ethan." Claire gave me a look. "No, she loves what Ethan can become." I hated hearing it because part of me already feared it might be true. Claire leaned back in her chair. "You know what bothers me most? Ethan acts nervous around her, like he's constantly trying not to fail some invisible test." That sentence stayed with me, because once she said it, I couldn't unsee it. At the bridal shower a month later, I watched Ethan carry gift boxes across a luxury hotel ballroom, while Brittany corrected tiny details nonstop. "No, not there. Fix the ribbon. Smile more." And Ethan obeyed every instruction instantly, like a man terrified of disappointing her. Toward the end of the shower, one of Brittany's wealthy friends approached our table. "So how do you know the bride?" she asked me casually. Before I could answer, Brittany said brightly, "This is Ethan's mom." Just that. Not Andrea, not she's family, just Ethan's mom. The woman smiled politely before immediately turning back toward Brittany. I sat there holding my coffee cup, suddenly feeling invisible. Later that evening, Ethan drove me home. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while we crossed the bridge into Savannah. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then quietly I asked, "Are you happy, Ethan?" He looked startled. "Of course I am. You don't seem like yourself anymore." His jaw tightened. "Mom, please don't make this difficult." Difficult. Another new word. I turned toward the window so he wouldn't see the tears forming in my eyes. Somewhere along the way, loving my son had started feeling like walking through a room full of glass, and I was beginning to realize Brittany wasn't just changing the wedding. She was changing Ethan, and I still had no idea how far that change would go. The rain started just after sunset. Heavy Georgia rain, the kind that turns the streets silver under porch lights and makes the whole world feel lonely. I remember because I had just taken a peach cobbler out of the oven when the doorbell rang. For one foolish second, my heart lifted. Ethan. Maybe he wanted to apologize for canceling dinner again. Maybe he missed me. Maybe he finally saw what was happening. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the front door with a smile already forming. But the second I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. My son looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. His shoulders were tense beneath his dark raincoat, and he avoided my eyes, the way children do when they're about to confess something terrible. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly. I stepped aside immediately. "You're soaked. Come in." He walked into the house slowly, bringing the smell of rain and wet pavement with him. I noticed he didn't hug me. That hurt more than it should have. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon and butter from the cobbler. Usually Ethan loved that smell. Usually he'd steal bites before dinner and grin like a teenager when I scolded him. But that night he barely looked around. "You made dessert," he said absent-mindedly. "I didn't know if you were coming." He nodded but said nothing else. The silence stretched strangely between us. I poured him coffee out of habit. He didn't touch it. Finally, I sat across from him at the kitchen table. "What's going on?" Ethan rubbed both hands together nervously. For a moment, I actually thought he might be having second thoughts about the wedding, but then he finally spoke. "Mom, Brittany and I need to talk to you about something. Need. Not want. Need." I felt my stomach tighten immediately. "Okay." He stared down at the table. "Her parents are very particular about the wedding." I waited. "And there's been a lot of stress lately. Still waiting." Then came the sentence that split my heart clean in half. "We think it might be better if you didn't come." At first, I genuinely thought I misunderstood him. The rain hammered harder against the windows. What Ethan swallowed hard. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it already is." I laughed softly from pure disbelief. "Harder," I repeated. "Ethan, are you saying you don't want me at your wedding?" He finally looked up then, and what hurt most was that he looked ashamed. Not angry, ashamed. "Brittany's family is worried about tension," he said carefully. "And honestly, things have felt uncomfortable for a while." Uncomfortable. That word landed like a slap. I stared at the little boy I once rocked through fevers, the teenager I helped study for exams, the grieving son I held at his father's funeral. And suddenly I couldn't recognize him anymore. "Are you ashamed of me?" I asked quietly. His face immediately tightened. "No." But he answered too fast. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "Then why am I being treated like some problem you need to hide, Mom? It's not like that. Then tell me what it's like." He stood up abruptly and walked toward the sink, too restless to stay seated. "It's just, Brittany's parents come from a different world." There it was, a different world. I almost smiled hearing it because suddenly everything made sense. The fancy venues, the corrected manners, the constant pressure to appear more polished, more refined, more sophisticated. And me, I reminded them where Ethan really came from. A middle-class Savannah family built on hard work and Sunday dinners instead of country clubs and luxury branding. Ethan kept talking, words tumbling out faster now. "They think there's been too much friction already, and Brittany's under pressure, and I just want one peaceful day, okay? One peaceful day. As if my presence would ruin it. As if I were some embarrassing relative people whispered about at receptions." I looked toward the hallway where Ethan's childhood photos still hung on the wall. Soccer uniforms, graduation pictures, Christmas mornings. Every version of my son still loved me in those frames. So where had that boy gone? "When were you planning to tell people I wasn't there?" I asked. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. We said you weren't feeling well." I actually felt dizzy after hearing that. The lie had already been prepared. Not impulsive, planned. I stood up slowly and walked to the counter because suddenly I needed something solid to hold on to. The kitchen felt too small, too quiet. "I spent $40,000 helping pay for this wedding," I said softly, "and you're telling guests I'm too sick to attend." His face twisted with guilt. "I never asked you to do that." That sentence nearly destroyed me, because technically he was right. Parents give because we love, not because we expect repayment, but love should still mean something. "I see," I whispered. "Mom." "No," I interrupted gently. "I finally understand." Ethan stepped closer, then panic flickering across his face for the first time. "I'm not trying to hurt you." But he already had. The cruelest part was that I could see he knew it too. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. Not yet. Not while he stood there choosing another family over his own mother. I folded the dish towel carefully, just to keep my hands from shaking. Then quietly I asked the question that mattered most. "If your father were alive, would you still do this?" Ethan froze. The silence after that was unbearable because we both knew the answer. Daniel Patterson would never have allowed anyone to humiliate me this way. Ethan looked down again. "That's not fair." "No," I said softly. "None of this is fair." For a moment I thought maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would suddenly realize how monstrous this entire conversation had become. Instead, he said something even worse. "I just want everyone to get along. Everyone. Again. Everyone except me." I nodded slowly then, and something inside me became very calm. Not healed, not okay, just calm in the way people become calm right before accepting a terrible truth. I walked to the front door and opened it for him. Rain blew cold air into the house. Ethan looked startled. "That's it," I met his eyes finally. "You made your decision." "Mom." "I won't come." He stared at me uncertainly, almost like he expected screaming or begging or guilt, but I was too heartbroken for any of that. He stepped toward me awkwardly. I didn't mean for this to happen. I looked at my son standing in my doorway, and for one terrible second, he felt like a stranger. "Yes," I said quietly, "you did." The words hit him hard. I saw it in his face, but not hard enough to stop him from leaving. Ethan hesitated another moment before finally walking out into the rain. I watched him get into his car, watched the headlights disappear down the street, and then I locked the front door. The silence afterward was deafening. I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the untouched cobbler still cooling on the counter. Then finally, after holding myself together for the entire conversation, I broke. I slid slowly onto the floor beside the kitchen table and cried so hard my chest hurt. Not delicate tears, not graceful sadness. The kind of grief that shakes your entire body. Because in that moment, I realized something devastating. My son hadn't just excluded me from his wedding. He had chosen to make me feel disposable. And somehow, deep down, I already sensed this story wasn't going to end at that wedding, not even close. The morning of Ethan's wedding arrived warm and painfully beautiful. Savannah sunlight poured through my kitchen windows like nothing in the world had changed. Birds chirped. Neighbors walked their dogs. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. It felt almost offensive that the world could continue so normally, while my heart still felt shattered. I woke up at 6:30 after barely sleeping at all. For several long seconds, I forgot what day it was. Then I saw the navy dress hanging on my bedroom door and remembered everything at once. "Please don't come." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at that dress for nearly 10 minutes. I had bought it 3 months earlier, after Ethan told me the wedding colors would be silver and deep blue. I remembered standing in the boutique changing room, smoothing the fabric over my waist, and thinking Daniel would have teased me for checking the mirror so many times. "You still look beautiful, Annie," he used to say whenever he caught me doubting myself. Daniel was the only person who ever called me Annie. The memory hit me so hard that morning I had to close my eyes. For a moment I considered putting the dress away forever, but instead I stood up slowly and put it on. I honestly don't know why. Maybe part of me still needed to feel like Ethan's mother for one last day. The fabric fit perfectly. Navy silk. Simple but elegant. I fastened my pearl earrings with trembling fingers and brushed my gray hair carefully the way I would have if I were actually attending the wedding. Then I sat alone at the kitchen table drinking coffee while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly through the silence. Around 9:30, Claire Monroe called. "You holding up?" "No," I answered honestly. "Good," she said, because pretending would annoy me. That made me laugh weakly despite myself. Claire offered to come over, but I declined. I didn't want anyone seeing me like this. Some grief feels too private for witnesses. After we hung up, I wandered through the house restlessly. The quiet became unbearable. I tried reading, couldn't focus, tried watching television. Everything irritated me. Finally, I found myself standing in front of the upstairs hallway closet where Daniel kept old documents and family keepsakes. I hadn't opened those boxes in years. After his death, I avoided them because every item carried too much memory inside it. But something pulled me there that morning. Maybe loneliness. Maybe instinct. Or maybe some part of Daniel was still trying to protect me even after all these years. I climbed the small ladder slowly and reached for the dark wooden box labeled Patterson Holdings Personal. Daniel's handwriting. Just seeing it made my throat tighten. I carried the box downstairs carefully and placed it on the dining table. Dust coated the lid. Inside were old photographs, insurance records, business files, handwritten notes, and property documents from the years Daniel ran Patterson Development Group before selling most of the company. I smiled faintly at one old photo of Ethan sitting on Daniel's shoulders near a construction site when he was about 6 years old, both of them grinning, both covered in dirt. Back then, success meant building things, not impressing strangers. I continued sorting through papers absent-mindedly until one folder caught my attention. Sinclair Cove Coastal Property Holdings. My stomach tightened immediately. Sinclair Cove, the wedding venue. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were legal documents bearing both Daniel's signature and mine. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then memory came rushing back all at once. Years ago, before Daniel got sick, he had quietly purchased a large stretch of Charleston coastal property through a private trust investment. At the time, luxury resorts hadn't yet exploded in value along that area. Daniel believed the land would someday become enormously profitable, but there was something even more important. The trust ownership. My name, not Daniel's, mine. I stared at the papers in disbelief, because technically, Sinclair Cove Resort belonged to me. Or more specifically, it belonged to the Patterson Family Trust under my authority. I sat back slowly in my chair. My pulse began pounding. How had I forgotten this? Then I remembered. After Daniel died, I intentionally stepped away from most financial operations. Rachel Bennett handled many trust details while I focused on surviving grief and helping Ethan rebuild his life. The resort had been leased and professionally managed for years. Income flowed quietly into long-term investments without requiring my direct involvement. I rarely thought about it anymore. But now my son was getting married on property legally tied to me. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. The irony felt almost cruel. The mother too embarrassing to attend the wedding. Was the actual owner of the venue. I stood up abruptly and walked toward the kitchen window, trying to steady my breathing. Outside sunlight danced across the porch steps, while somewhere in Charleston, guests were probably arriving at my property, pretending it belonged to the Sinclair's glamorous world. Suddenly, dozens of little moments started rearranging themselves inside my mind. Victor Sinclair's unusual enthusiasm about the venue, Brittany insisting on that exact location, the strange tension whenever finances came up. And then another memory surfaced. About 6 weeks earlier, Victor had approached me briefly during a rehearsal planning dinner. We had been standing near the valet entrance while Ethan and Brittany spoke with vendors nearby. Victor smiled in that polished businessman way of his and said, "You and Daniel always had remarkable instincts with property." At the time, I assumed he meant Daniel's old construction career. Now I realized something chilling. Victor knew, or at least suspected. I hurried back to the dining table and continued flipping through documents faster now. Property transfers, management contracts, tax filings. Then I found another paper clipped separately from the others. A recent business inquiry, requested by Sinclair Event Ventures, Victor Sinclair's company. I stared at it in silence. Why was Victor requesting detailed operational information about Sinclair Cove Resort, unless... No. My chest tightened painfully. Unless this wedding was about more than appearances, I reached immediately for my phone and called Rachel Bennett. She answered on the second ring. Well, if it isn't the woman avoiding weddings today, I need you to tell me something honestly, I said. My voice must have sounded strange because Rachel immediately became serious. What happened? Does Victor Sinclair know the Patterson Trust owns Sinclair Cove? There was a pause, too long, and suddenly I knew the answer before she spoke. Andrea Rachel said carefully, "Why are you asking me this now?" Ice spread through my stomach. Rachel. Another silence. Then finally, I think he may know more than he should. The room suddenly felt colder. I gripped the edge of the table. What does that mean? Rachel exhaled heavily. It means I've been trying not to alarm you until I confirmed a few things. Fear crawled slowly up my spine. What things? And then Rachel said the sentence that changed everything. Victor Sinclair has been trying to position himself around Patterson assets for months. I stopped breathing for a second. Outside church bells rang faintly somewhere across Savannah, probably announcing noon, probably announcing the beginning of my son's wedding day. And for the first time since Ethan told me not to come, I no longer felt only heartbroken. I felt afraid. Rachel Bennett arrived at my house less than an hour later carrying 2 leather folders and the kind of expression lawyers wear when they're deciding how much truth someone can emotionally survive at once. I had known Rachel for nearly 30 years. She handled Daniel's estate after his death, managed most of the Patterson Trust legal structures, and once threatened a contractor so fiercely over fraudulent invoices that the man practically confessed before she finished speaking. Rachel was 5 years younger than me, sharp as broken glass, and fiercely protective of the people she loved. The moment she stepped into my kitchen, she took one look at my face and said quietly, "You didn't know." It wasn't a question. I shook my head slowly. No. Rachel set the folders down on the dining table and removed her coat. "You should sit." That sentence alone terrified me. I lowered myself into a chair while Rachel carefully spread documents across the table between us. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted golden over Savannah, but inside my house, everything suddenly felt gray. Rachel pointed toward the original property trust agreement first. Daniel placed Sinclair Cove under a protected family trust almost 15 years ago. Ownership authority transferred entirely to you after his death. I stared at the papers numbly. I honestly forgot half of this existed. That's because you were grieving, Rachel said gently, and because Daniel intentionally structured things to operate quietly. That sounded exactly like my husband. Daniel hated flashy wealth. Most people in Savannah assumed we were comfortable but ordinary. Even Ethan never fully understood the size of the Patterson investments because Daniel believed too much money spoiled perspective. "We wanted Ethan grounded," I whispered. Rachel nodded. "I know." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Rachel opened the second folder. That one looked newer, more dangerous somehow. "These," she said carefully, "are what concern me." Inside were copies of business proposals, financing drafts, promotional agreements, and legal correspondence involving Victor Sinclair. My pulse immediately quickened. Rachel slid one document toward me. "Victor Sinclair has spent the last 6 months attempting to establish strategic partnerships connected to Sinclair Cove." I frowned. "But he doesn't own it." "No," Rachel replied, "but he appears to believe he eventually will." Cold spread slowly through my chest. I looked down again at the paperwork. Some forms included Ethan's signature, my son's signature. My hands began shaking. What exactly did Ethan sign? Rachel hesitated. That terrified me even more. "Rachel." She exhaled carefully. "Mostly preliminary financial guarantees." Meaning Victor convinced Ethan to personally support future development negotiations tied to the resort. I stared at her blankly. "Why would Ethan do that?" Rachel's expression darkened. "Because I don't think Ethan understands what he's signing." A horrible memory surfaced instantly. About 2 months earlier, Ethan had casually mentioned Victor wanted his opinion on some future investment opportunities. I remembered warning him lightly. "Never sign anything without reading every word." Ethan laughed back then. "Mom, I'm an architect, not an idiot." The memory hurt now. because intelligent people can still be manipulated by people they trust, especially when love is involved. Rachel continued carefully. I've reviewed enough to believe Victor intended to use the marriage to position himself closer to Patterson Trust assets. I looked up sharply. You think Brittany knew? Rachel didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. My stomach twisted violently. Suddenly, I remembered every subtle insult, every attempt to distance me from the wedding, every carefully controlled interaction, not because I embarrassed them, because I was dangerous to their plan. I was the one person who could expose everything. Oh my God, I whispered. Rachel leaned forward. Andrea, listen to me carefully. I still don't know exactly how much Ethan understands, but Victor definitely knows Sinclair Cove is tied to your trust, how, most likely, through old development records and corporate filings. Daniel's name still appears historically on some connected documents. I covered my mouth with my hand. All this time I thought Brittany disliked me because I wasn't sophisticated enough, but maybe sophistication had never been the issue at all. Maybe they simply needed me gone, invisible, removed from the wedding before I noticed what was happening. A wave of nausea hit me suddenly. I stood up and walked toward the sink, trying to breathe through it. Behind me, Rachel spoke gently. You don't have to protect Ethan from the truth anymore, but mothers don't stop being mothers just because their hearts are broken. That's my son, I whispered, if he's involved in something illegal. I don't think he understands the full picture, Rachel interrupted. That's exactly why I'm worried. I closed my eyes. Ethan had always been trusting. Too trusting sometimes. As a child, he once gave away his entire allowance because another boy claimed his family couldn't afford groceries. Daniel later discovered the story wasn't true at all. You've got your mother's heart, Daniel told him afterward. I used to think that was Ethan's greatest quality. Now I wondered if it made him vulnerable. Rachel rose from the table and walked beside me. Have you spoken to him since last night? I shook my head. No. Do you want to? The answer surprised me. No, not yet. Because beneath the heartbreak, something else had started growing quietly inside me. Clarity. For months I had blamed myself. My age, my background, my manners. I thought Brittany saw me as unsophisticated, but now I realize something important. People who truly love you don't make you feel small. They isolate you when you threaten something they want. Rachel returned to the table and opened another document. There's more. Of course there was. There's always more, I muttered bitterly. Rachel almost smiled. Then she pointed to a luxury development proposal attached to Sinclair Cove's future expansion plans. Projected profits covered multiple pages: hotels, private residences, marina construction, corporate partnerships. Massive numbers. Millions upon millions. Victor Sinclair wasn't interested in Ethan because he loved his daughter's happiness. Victor saw access, legacy, money. And suddenly, another memory hit me hard. At the engagement dinner, Victor had raised a champagne glass and said, "To merging strong families." At the time, everyone laughed politely. Now the words sounded sinister. Rachel tapped another page. This is what concerns me most. I leaned closer. There, buried deep in legal language, was a future authorization clause involving marital asset positioning and projected development oversight. My chest tightened. Would this affect the Patterson Trust? Potentially, Rachel said carefully, especially if Ethan gained future controlling access through inheritance structures. Inheritance. I sank slowly back into my chair. Daniel had spent his entire life building security for our family, and now strangers were circling it like vultures. The worst part, Ethan had unknowingly opened the door for them himself. Tears burned my eyes again. But this time they felt different, less helpless, more furious. Rachel watched me carefully. What are you thinking? I stared down at the wedding invitation still sitting on my kitchen counter. Ethan and Brittany. Gold lettering. Perfect photographs. Perfect lies. Then slowly I said, they wanted me absent. Rachel nodded cautiously. Yes, because if I were there, I continued softly, I might notice something. Possibly. I let out a long breath. Then, for the first time all day, I smiled. Not because anything felt good, but because suddenly I understood something Victor Sinclair didn't. He thought humiliating me made me weak. But grief changes women, especially older women. By our age, we've survived Funerals, betrayals, illnesses, disappointments, loneliness, childbirth and heartbreak people half our age couldn't survive. We stopped fearing difficult truths, and we learned something dangerous. Silence can be more powerful than screaming. Rachel studied my face carefully. What do you want to do? I looked toward the window where evening light stretched long across the porch. Somewhere in Charleston, guests were arriving. Champagne was flowing, string quartets were warming up, and my son was preparing to marry a woman who had helped erase me from the happiest day of his life. A younger version of me might have rushed there immediately, demanded answers, created a scene, but not anymore. No, I said quietly. Rachel frowned slightly. No, what? I'm not stopping the wedding. Andrea. I said I'm not stopping it. I looked directly at her then. They built this entire lie believing I wouldn't discover the truth. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. I continued softly. So let them continue. A slow understanding crossed her face. Andrea. I folded my hands calmly on the table. I won't destroy anything. Then, after a long pause, I added, the truth will do it for me. By 6 o'clock that evening, Charleston was glowing under golden sunset light, while I sat barefoot in my Savannah kitchen, staring at legal documents spread across my table. The contrast felt surreal. Somewhere 2 hours away, my son's wedding guests were sipping champagne beside the ocean, and here I was discovering that the family Ethan planned to marry into had likely spent months manipulating him. Rachel stayed until nearly sunset, organizing paperwork into neat stacks while I slowly pieced together the truth. The deeper we looked, the uglier it became. Victor Sinclair wasn't merely ambitious. He was strategic. Every move connected to the wedding suddenly looked calculated. The venue selection, the rushed financial discussions, the sudden pressure surrounding future opportunities. Even the expensive wedding itself now seemed less like a celebration and more like a business presentation, wrapped in white roses and designer candles. At one point, Rachel removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. I hate saying this, she admitted, but I think Brittany knew exactly what her father was doing. I looked down at the engagement photo on the invitation lying beside my coffee cup. Brittany's smile suddenly looked different now, sharper somehow, less loving. You really believe she wanted Ethan for access to the Patterson Trust? Rachel hesitated carefully. I think she wanted the life connected to it. That answer hurt in a strange way because it sounded worse. Not love, not partnership, lifestyle, status, opportunity. I stood and walked toward the living room window, where twilight shadows stretched across the porch swing Daniel built years ago. He loved her, I whispered. Rachel's voice softened behind me. I know. No, I said quietly. You don't understand. Ethan truly loved her. That was the tragedy underneath everything else. My son wasn't cruel by nature. Weak sometimes, yes. Too eager to please. Too desperate to fit into Brittany's world, but not malicious. And somehow that made this entire situation even sadder, because Ethan had sacrificed the wrong person trying to keep Brittany happy. Me. Rachel gathered another group of papers. There's something else you should know. I turned back slowly. There are communications between Victor and outside investors referencing future marital asset alignment. The phrase sounded disgusting. Cold. Clinical. Like Ethan wasn't a human being at all. Just a bridge toward wealth. Did Ethan see those, I asked? I doubt it. I sat down heavily again. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the hallway. Outside, cicadas buzzed through the humid Georgia evening. Then finally, Rachel asked carefully, What exactly are you planning to do tomorrow? The wedding. For a second, grief crashed over me all over again, because beneath the anger and fear and betrayal, I still miss my son. I miss the Ethan who used to bring me soup when I was sick, the Ethan who cried at his father's funeral, the Ethan who once called me from college just to ask how long to bake sweet potatoes because he wanted Thanksgiving to feel normal without us there. How do mothers reconcile those memories with the people their children become? I looked down at my wedding ring resting beside the documents. I still wore it sometimes around the house when I missed Daniel badly enough. What would Daniel do? I whispered aloud. Rachel answered immediately. He'd protect you. I smiled sadly. Yes, but he'd protect Ethan too. That was always Daniel's weakness. Family first, even when family disappointed you, especially then. Rachel leaned forward. Andrea listened to me carefully. You are under no obligation to save Ethan from consequences he helped create. I knew she was right. But love complicates right and wrong. I'm not trying to save him, I said quietly. Rachel studied me. Then what are you trying to do? The answer came before I could stop it. I want him to see the truth himself, not through me screaming, not through accusations, not through public humiliation. I wanted Ethan to wake up on his own. Because truths discovered personally cut deeper than truths forced onto you by someone else. Rachel was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. I think that's exactly what Victor underestimated about you. What, he assumed you'd react emotionally. I laughed softly. Oh, I reacted emotionally. No, Rachel said. You reacted intelligently. That surprised me because I certainly didn't feel intelligent. I felt exhausted, heartbroken, old. But maybe Rachel was right about one thing. Victor Sinclair expected chaos. He expected a wounded mother storming into the wedding demanding respect. He expected tears, scenes, drama. Instead, I stayed home, and silence frightened manipulative people far more than anger ever could. Around 8:30 that night, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. Ethan. My heart immediately lurched. Rachel glanced toward the screen but said nothing. For several seconds, I simply stared at his name flashing across my phone. Then I answered. Hello, music and distant voices echoed loudly behind him. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded distracted, nervous, like he called out of obligation instead of desire. You okay? I asked automatically, even after everything that was still my first instinct. Motherhood is terrifying that way. Sometimes your love survives long after your pride should have ended it. Yeah, Ethan replied quickly. Just busy. A painful silence followed. I waited for an apology that never came. Finally, he said, I just wanted to make sure you got home okay last night. Last night, like I was some acquaintance he'd inconvenienced instead of his mother. I'm home, I answered quietly. Another silence. Then Ethan lowered his voice slightly. Brittany's parents asked about you earlier. There was something strange in his tone. Uneasy. What did you tell them? That you weren't feeling well. The lie again. Something inside me hardened further. And did they seem disappointed? I asked carefully. Ethan hesitated. Not exactly. Rachel looked up sharply across the table. Interesting. Not exactly. Meaning what? Relief, satisfaction, fear? Ethan continued quickly. Anyway, tomorrow's going to be hectic. Tomorrow. Not our wedding. Not family. Just logistics now. I understand. Another pause stretched between us. Then, softly, unexpectedly, Ethan said, I do wish things were different. My chest tightened painfully hearing that. Because buried underneath all his weakness, some part of my son still knew this was wrong. But knowing something is wrong and having the courage to stop it are very different things. I close my eyes briefly. So do I. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then finally, Ethan cleared his throat. I should go. I almost said I love you. The words rose automatically to my lips after decades of habit, but something stopped me. Not punishment, not revenge, just sadness. So instead I said, Good night, Ethan. His silence lasted a fraction too long before he answered, Good night, Mom. The line disconnected. I stared at my phone, afterward feeling strangely hollow. Rachel spoke carefully. He sounds uncertain. He sounds trapped, I whispered. That was the worst part. I genuinely believed Ethan had convinced himself sacrificing me was necessary to preserve his future. But healthy love never demands cruelty toward your own family. And somewhere deep down, I think Ethan already knew that too. Rachel eventually gathered her folders and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. What time does the ceremony start tomorrow? 3:00. She nodded slowly. If anything escalates, I'll call immediately. I walked her outside onto the porch. Warm night air wrapped around us, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city. Rachel touched my arm gently. You know none of this is your fault, right? I looked toward the dark street quietly. I keep replaying every moment, wondering where I lost him. You didn't lose him, Rachel said firmly. He lost himself. After she left, I remained on the porch alone for a long time. The neighborhood sat peaceful around me, porch lights glowing, crickets humming, ordinary life continuing. And suddenly I realized something painful but true. Brittany and Victor never truly understood me. They saw an aging widow with soft manners and southern politeness. They assumed kindness meant weakness. But women my age survive by learning when silence matters more than fighting. And tomorrow I wasn't going to destroy their lies. I was simply going to stop protecting them from the truth. At exactly 3 o'clock, the next afternoon, my son stood beneath white roses and ocean light while pretending his mother simply didn't exist. I know the exact time because I couldn't stop staring at the clock in my living room. 3 o'clock. The ceremony had begun, and 200 miles away in Charleston, guests were probably rising from their seats, while a string quartet played some delicate arrangement Brittany had approved after rejecting every song Ethan actually liked. I tried not to imagine it, tried not to picture Ethan standing at the altar searching the crowd for me, even after telling me not to come. But heartbreak is cruel that way. Your mind keeps returning to the very places your heart cannot survive. I spent most of the afternoon cleaning things that were already clean: kitchen counters, bookshelves, cabinet handles, anything to keep my hands busy. By 4:30, Claire Monroe arrived, carrying fried chicken and potato salad because apparently she believed emotional devastation required carbohydrates. "You look terrible," she announced the second I opened the door. "Thank you. You're welcome." She marched straight into the kitchen like she owned the place and started unpacking containers. "You eaten today?" "Not really." Claire narrowed her eyes at me. "That ends now." Normally her bluntness made me laugh, but that afternoon I felt too emotionally drained for humor. I sat quietly at the kitchen table while Claire filled 2 plates. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then finally she asked softly, "You thinking about him all the time?" That answer came too fast. Too honestly. Claire sighed. "That boy better wake up before it's too late." I stared down at my untouched food. What if he doesn't? Claire didn't answer immediately. Because women our age know some truths are too painful to rush. Finally, she said, "Then you survive it anyway." Simple, brutal, true. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed loudly across the table. Both of us froze. Unknown Charleston number. Something inside me tightened instantly. I answered carefully. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson." The man sounded nervous. "Yes, this is Howard Green from Sinclair Cove Resort." Claire immediately looked up sharply. Mr. Green continued quickly. "I apologize for disturbing you, ma'am, but I believe there's a situation you should know about." I sat straighter instantly. "What kind of situation?" There was loud music and distant voices behind him. "Certain members of the Sinclair family are requesting immediate discussions regarding long-term venue rights and future development usage." I frowned. What does that have to do with me? Another pause, then carefully. "They appear to believe they already possess authority to negotiate." Cold spread slowly through my chest. "Victor." "Of course." I closed my eyes briefly. "And who exactly is negotiating Victor Sinclair and several investors?" My stomach turned. During the wedding reception, while Ethan celebrated his marriage, Victor was already conducting business. Not family, not love, business. I exchanged a glance with Claire. "What exactly are they trying to do?" I asked quietly. Mr. Green lowered his voice further. "They're discussing exclusive future control arrangements tied to Sinclair Cove property access." There it was, not subtle anymore, not hidden beneath politeness and wedding flowers. Control. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the living room window while listening. Outside, evening sunlight painted long shadows across the porch. Inside, my pulse hammered painfully. "Do they know you called me no, ma'am? Why call at all?" The man hesitated, then softly. "Because your late husband treated my father fairly for 30 years, and because something about this feels wrong." Emotion unexpectedly tightened my throat. Daniel always said character mattered more than money. Even decades later, kindness still echoed through places I didn't even realize he'd touched. I steadied myself carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Green." There's something else, he added nervously. What your son appears uncomfortable. That sentence hit me harder than everything else, because despite all my anger, I still worried about Ethan. What do you mean he's asking questions now? Mr. Sinclair doesn't seem pleased about it. Claire mouthed silently, "What's happening?" I covered the phone briefly. Victor's already discussing property control at the reception. Claire's eyes widened with fury. That's Snake. Meanwhile, Mr. Green continued. There's pressure building, ma'am. Pressure, yes. Because lies become unstable once too many people start pulling at them. I thanked him again and ended the call slowly. For several moments, the room stayed silent. Then Claire exploded. At the wedding reception. They're doing business deals at the wedding reception. I sat down carefully, because my knees suddenly felt weak. It was never just about Ethan. Claire stared at me. No, she said quietly. It wasn't. I looked toward the wedding invitation still resting on the counter. The elegant gold lettering suddenly looked almost sinister now. How many moments had been fake? How much affection had been performance? And worst of all, had Brittany ever truly loved Ethan at all? Claire folded her arms tightly. So what now? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was I didn't fully know. I only knew one thing for certain. The cracks had started forming, and once truth begins surfacing inside carefully constructed lies, panic usually follows. Almost as if summoned by that thought, my phone buzzed again 20 minutes later. This time it was Ethan. I answered instantly. Ethan. The noise behind him sounded chaotic now. Voices, music, tension. Mom, he said sharply. Did you talk to anyone from Sinclair Cove today? My stomach tightened. Interesting. Very interesting. No, I answered carefully. Why? A long silence followed. Then, because apparently there's confusion about ownership documents. There it was. The beginning. I kept my voice calm. What kind of confusion? Ethan sounded distracted, like people were talking around him. I don't know. Some legal paperwork came up and Victor's acting weird and... He stopped himself suddenly. Mom, did Dad ever have business ties here? I closed my eyes briefly. My poor son. You're finally starting to see it. Yes, I answered softly. Another silence. Then Ethan lowered his voice. Why didn't you tell me? The question almost made me laugh from sheer heartbreak, because for months he never wanted to hear anything from me. Now, suddenly, he wanted answers. I didn't realize I was supposed to explain my existence to attend your wedding, I said quietly. That hurt him. I could hear it instantly. Mom. Behind him, I suddenly heard Victor Sinclair's voice faintly in the background. Ethan, we need to handle this now. Handle this. Like I was a problem, not family. Ethan sounded flustered. I have to go. Of course you do. Mom, wait. But I had already ended the call. My hand trembled afterward. Claire leaned forward immediately. What happened? I stared at the dark phone screen. The truth started leaking. And suddenly, for the first time since Ethan told me not to come, I didn't feel powerless anymore. I felt sad, deeply sad, but not powerless, because something Victor Sinclair never considered was beginning to happen. Ethan was asking questions, and manipulative people fear questions more than anything else. Outside evening settled fully over Savannah. Streetlights flickered on. The porch swing creaked softly in the breeze. And somewhere in Charleston, my son's perfect wedding was beginning to crack apart from the inside. Not because I destroyed it, because lies cannot survive forever once the wrong person finally notices the truth. By 9 o'clock that night, the wedding reception had turned into exactly what Victor Sinclair feared most. Confusion. Not public chaos yet. Not screaming or broken champagne glasses. Just something quieter and far more dangerous. Questions. And once people begin asking questions at events built entirely on appearances, panic spreads fast. I sat alone in my living room, listening to rain tap softly against the windows, while my phone rested beside me on the coffee table. Claire had finally gone home an hour earlier after threatening to personally drive to Charleston and flip over a centerpiece if anyone hurt Ethan further. Under normal circumstances, that would have made me laugh, but nothing about that night felt normal anymore. The house seemed unusually still. Even the old grandfather clock sounded louder. Tick, 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 like time itself was waiting for something. I tried reading again, but couldn't focus. Every few minutes, my mind drifted back to Ethan's voice on the phone. Why didn't you tell me? Because you stopped listening. Because you chose strangers over your own mother. Because you made me feel like a humiliation instead of family. But beneath all those truths lived another one I hated admitting I still wanted him safe. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Even after your child breaks your heart, part of you still wants to protect them from pain. Around 9:15, my phone rang again. This time it was Rachel. I answered immediately. What happened? Rachel didn't waste time. Victor's trying to contain the situation. I sat upright instantly. How bad is it? Bad enough that multiple guests overheard arguments near the reception office. A strange sadness settled over me hearing that. Because despite everything, some part of me still grieved. The wedding Ethan should have had. A joyful one, a real one. Not this performance collapsing beneath hidden agendas. Rachel continued. Apparently, Ethan demanded to review documents himself after hearing management mention the Patterson Trust. Good. That was good. For months, Ethan had been floating through life, allowing stronger personalities to make decisions around him. Maybe this was the first time he'd finally stopped and asked, what exactly is happening here? What did Victor say? I asked quietly. Rachel gave a short, humorless laugh. According to one staff member, Victor said this was a family misunderstanding and told Ethan not to embarrass Brittany tonight. Embarrass Brittany. Interesting. Not, let's clarify the truth. Not, let's be transparent. Just, don't embarrass her. Manipulative people always protect appearances first. I walked slowly toward the kitchen while holding the phone. What about Brittany? Another pause. Then Rachel answered carefully. She's apparently furious. That didn't surprise me. Brittany liked control too much to tolerate uncertainty, and tonight, for the first time since she entered Ethan's life, she no longer controlled the narrative. Rachel lowered her voice. Andrea, there's another development. My stomach tightened. What now? Victor's attorney tried contacting resort management, requesting temporary authorization paperwork. I stopped walking. Authorization for what? Future development access. I actually laughed out loud from disbelief. At the wedding reception. During his daughter's wedding reception. Victor Sinclair was still trying to secure business leverage. The greed of it stunned even me. He really thought this would work, I whispered. Oh, he absolutely thought it would work, Rachel replied. Because he assumed nobody would question him. Nobody except the mother they tried to erase. I leaned against the kitchen counter silently. Then Rachel said something unexpected. Howard Green believes Ethan overheard more than Victor realizes. My pulse quickened slightly. What do you mean? There was apparently an argument near one of the private offices. Ethan walked in while Victor was discussing future marital asset positioning with investors. The room suddenly felt colder. Ethan heard that phrase. Marital asset positioning. Not love, not family, not commitment. Assets. My son reduced to a financial pathway. I closed my eyes painfully. How did Ethan react? He demanded answers. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Because buried underneath all the betrayal and anger, I felt relief. Not relief that Ethan was hurting, never that, but relief that he was finally seeing reality clearly. The illusion Brittany built around him was cracking, and once illusions break, they rarely rebuild the same way again. Rachel continued carefully. I think you should prepare yourself. There's a strong chance Ethan may contact you again tonight. The thought made my chest tighten immediately. I didn't know what I wanted from him anymore. An apology. An explanation. Regret, could any of those things undo what he'd already done? Probably not. Still, he was my son. I understand, I whispered. After we hung up, I poured myself tea, even though my hands were shaking too badly to hold the kettle steadily. Rain continued falling softly outside. Savannah nights always smell different after rain. Cleaner somehow. Earth and jasmine and wet pavement. Daniel loved nights like that. He used to open the windows and say storms made the city honest. Funny thing to remember at a moment like this. But grief brings people back in strange ways. I carried the tea into the living room and sat quietly in the dim lamplight. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to look directly at Ethan's wedding photo from our engagement dinner. Not Ethan and Brittany, just Ethan, my handsome boy smiling in a navy suit. The same little boy who once cried for 3 days after accidentally stepping on a bird's wing when he was 7, sensitive, gentle, tender-hearted. So how did someone that kind become a man capable of humiliating his own mother? The answer came quietly. Fear, not evil. Fear. Fear of losing Brittany. Fear of disappointing powerful people. Fear of not belonging in their polished world. Weakness destroys people long before cruelty does. My thoughts were interrupted by another phone call. Ethan. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. His breathing sounded uneven immediately. Mom. Something had changed. I heard it instantly. The arrogance was gone. So was the rehearsed politeness. Now he just sounded shaken. What happened? I asked softly. A long silence followed. Then Ethan said something I never expected to hear. Did Brittany know? I closed my eyes slowly. There it was. The real question underneath everything else. Not about property, not about contracts, about betrayal. What exactly are you asking me? I replied carefully. His voice cracked slightly. Did she know about the trust? About the resort? About all of it? I didn't answer immediately, because sometimes people need to finish arriving at truth on their own. Finally, I asked, what do you believe? The silence after that felt enormous. Then quietly, I think everyone knew except me. My heart broke hearing it. Not because Ethan was innocent. He wasn't. He chose to wound me. He chose cowardice. But no mother wants her child destroyed by humiliation either, especially public humiliation. I'm sorry, he whispered suddenly. The words hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the couch. It was the first genuine apology he'd offered. Not for excluding me specifically, not yet, but for something, for beginning to understand. Tears blurred my vision instantly. Still, I kept my voice calm. Where are you right now? In one of the private offices. His breathing sounded ragged. There are people everywhere. Victor keeps saying this can be fixed. Brittany says I'm overreacting. Overreacting? Of course she did. Manipulative people always call pain an overreaction once they're exposed. I stood slowly and walked toward the dark window. What do you want from me, Ethan? That question shattered him. I heard it in the silence that followed. Then finally he whispered, I don't know. And somehow that was the saddest answer of all, because for the first time in a very long time, my son no longer sounded certain about the life he chose over me. The truth finally exploded at 9:47 p.m. Not with screaming, not with violence, but with a single envelope. An ordinary cream-colored legal envelope that arrived in the middle of my son's wedding reception and quietly destroyed every lie, holding the evening together. I know the exact time because Rachel called me the second it happened. They opened it, she said immediately. I stood so fast from the couch my tea nearly spilled. What happened? Rachel sounded breathless, like she had been walking quickly through chaos. Ethan demanded full documentation. After arguing with Victor, resort management brought out the ownership records. I closed my eyes briefly. It had begun. Outside my Savannah window, rain continued falling steadily, while 200 miles away, my son's marriage was unraveling beneath chandeliers and wedding flowers. Tell me everything, I whispered. Rachel lowered her voice. The reception had already become tense. Guests knew something was wrong because Ethan disappeared for almost 40 minutes. I could picture it perfectly. The ballroom buzzing with whispers, Brittany forcing smiles for nervous guests, Victor trying desperately to maintain control, and Ethan, somewhere behind closed doors, finally asking questions nobody wanted answered. Rachel continued. When Ethan returned, he looked furious. Victor kept insisting everything was a misunderstanding, but Ethan demanded proof. What kind of proof? Ownership records, financial agreements, development proposals, everything. I walked slowly into the kitchen while listening. My heart pounded so hard it almost hurt. What did Brittany do? Rachel gave a humorless laugh. She panicked. Good. Because manipulative people rarely know how to function once their carefully managed image collapses. She kept trying to pull Ethan away privately, Rachel explained, but Ethan refused. For months, Ethan avoided confrontation, avoided discomfort, avoided truth. Maybe tonight was the first time he finally stopped running from reality. Then Rachel said the sentence that changed everything. Howard Green personally handed Ethan the trust documentation in front of Victor. I leaned against the kitchen counter. And Ethan read your name. Silence filled my house. Deep, heavy, almost sacred somehow. Because at that exact moment, my son finally understood the full humiliation of what he'd done. The woman he erased from his wedding owned the ground beneath it. Rachel continued carefully. Apparently, Ethan thought there had to be some mistake at first. Of course he did, because Ethan still believed wealthy people like Victor operated honestly. He still thought manipulation looked obvious, but real manipulation hides beneath charm and confidence and polished smiles. What happened next, I asked quietly. Victor tried minimizing everything, claimed it was all procedural business strategy. Business strategy. I almost laughed bitterly, reducing betrayal to strategy. Typical. And Brittany, I repeated. Rachel paused, then softly. She admitted she knew. The room tilted slightly around me. Even though I already suspected it, hearing confirmation still hurt. Poor Ethan. Not because he deserved protection from consequences, but because there's something uniquely devastating about realizing the person you plan to spend your life with saw you as leverage instead of love. What exactly did she say? I asked. Rachel exhaled heavily. According to staff nearby, Ethan asked her directly if she knew Sinclair Cove belonged to the Patterson Trust. My chest tightened painfully. And she said yes. I closed my eyes. God. Rachel continued. She tried explaining that she didn't think it mattered, because eventually Ethan would inherit involvement anyway. Inheritance. There it was again, the future they planned around him without truly respecting him. I sat slowly at the kitchen table because suddenly my legs felt weak. Then Rachel said something that broke my heart completely. Andrea. Ethan apparently asked Brittany one question over and over. What question? A long pause followed. Then, quietly, would you still have wanted to marry me if my mother had nothing? Tears filled my eyes instantly, because that question revealed everything. Not financial fear, not wounded pride, just a man desperately trying to know whether he had ever truly been loved. I pressed trembling fingers against my mouth. What did she say? Rachel's silence answered first. Then finally, she didn't answer him directly. Of course she didn't. Because people motivated by status rarely survive honest questions. I stood again and walked toward the sink just to move somehow. Outside, thunder rolled softly over Savannah. Meanwhile, Rachel continued describing the scene unfolding inside the ballroom. Guests were openly whispering by then. Victor kept trying to redirect conversations toward future investments, which honestly only made him look guiltier. I shook my head slowly in disbelief. Even now, Victor still thought this was salvageable through business language and confidence. Men like him always assume money can smooth over betrayal, but emotional humiliation leaves stains wealth can't erase. Then Rachel lowered her voice further, and then Ethan found the guarantee documents. Ice spread instantly through my chest. The papers he signed, yes. I gripped the edge of the counter. How bad, potentially very bad, if those developments failed. Fear twisted painfully through me. Did he understand them? He does now. I close my eyes. My poor, foolish son. Rachel continued. Victor apparently framed the agreements as symbolic support for future family partnerships. Ethan trusted him. Trusted him. That word carried so much tragedy. Ethan trusted people who saw him as a pathway to money, and distrusted the mother who spent her entire life protecting him. The irony of it nearly crushed me. What happened after he read them? I whispered. Rachel answered immediately. He lost control. My pulse quickened. How? He confronted Brittany in front of everyone. I could practically hear the ballroom tension through Rachel's voice now. Crystal glasses, whispering guests, the orchestra stopping awkwardly, the collapse of performance. What did he say? Rachel inhaled slowly. He asked Brittany if excluding you from the wedding was part of the plan. Tears burned my eyes instantly. Because beneath everything else, Ethan finally understood the deepest wound. Not the contracts, not the money. Me. Rachel continued quietly. Brittany said they only wanted to avoid complications. Complications. Not mother, not family. Complications. Something inside me hardened hearing that. Rachel's voice softened. And then Ethan asked her why she never fought for you to be there. I covered my mouth completely then. Because that question mattered more than anything else. Not whether Brittany loved wealth, whether she possessed basic humanity. What did she say? I whispered again. Rachel sounded stunned even repeating it. She said, "Your mother always made things emotionally messy." The words sliced straight through me. Emotionally messy. Because I loved too openly, too sincerely, too maternally. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe properly. Then quietly, Rachel said, and that's when Ethan realized. Realized what? That nobody there loved him the way you did. Silence filled my kitchen again. Heavy silence. The kind grief leaves behind after truth finally settles. Then Rachel added softly, "He walked out of the ballroom." My heart lurched immediately. Where nobody knows yet. Fear rushed through me suddenly. No matter how hurt I was, Ethan was still my child. Was he alone? Yes. I grabbed my phone tighter instinctively. Did anyone go after him? Victor tried. Ethan told him not to touch him. Good. For once in his life, my son was finally setting boundaries, even if it happened too late. Rachel exhaled slowly. Andrea. I think the wedding's over. I looked around my quiet kitchen. The same kitchen where Ethan once sat eating peach cobbler after baseball practice. The same kitchen where he told me about his first heartbreak at 17. The same kitchen where he asked me not to come to his wedding. And now his perfect future had collapsed without me saying a single cruel word. I never exposed him publicly, never humiliated him, never sought revenge. I simply stopped protecting people from the truth. And sometimes, that's more powerful than anger ever could be. I didn't sleep at all that night, not because I was waiting for Ethan to call, and not because I felt victorious. There are no real winners when a family falls apart. I stayed awake because somewhere between heartbreak and truth, something inside me had finally stopped denying reality. My son had humiliated me. Brittany had manipulated him. Victor Sinclair had treated our family like a financial opportunity. And now all of them were drowning in the consequences they created together. Around midnight, Rachel called one last time before bed. They officially canceled the reception, she said. I sat quietly in the darkness of my living room, listening to rain against the windows. What about Brittany? She's still at the resort with her parents. And Ethan Rachel hesitated. No one can find him. Fear tightened my chest immediately. Despite everything that had happened, maternal instincts still overpowered pride. Has he been drinking? I don't know. Was he upset, Andrea? Rachel said gently. Your son just discovered his marriage was built on manipulation and financial strategy. Yes, he's upset. I closed my eyes painfully. Of course he was. I imagined him driving alone through dark South Carolina highways, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, while his entire future collapsed around him. Part of me wanted to call him immediately. Another part whispered, let him feel this, not out of cruelty, but because pain was finally teaching Ethan what comfort and protection had hidden from him for too long. Weakness has consequences. Cowardice has consequences, and allowing people to disrespect your family eventually destroys you too. Still, he was my son. Rachel finally convinced me to try resting. I managed maybe 2 hours of sleep before dawn light crept through the curtains. By 7:30 the next morning, Savannah smelled fresh from rain. I stood in the kitchen making coffee when someone knocked on my front door. 3 slow knocks. My heart instantly knew before my mind did. Ethan. I opened the door slowly, and there he was, still wearing the black tuxedo pants from the wedding, white dress shirt wrinkled and half untucked, tie gone, eyes bloodshot, rainwater and exhaustion clinging to him like another layer of grief. For one terrible second, he looked 12 years old again, lost, ashamed, broken. Mom, he whispered. My chest physically hurt seeing him. Not because he looked miserable, because he looked human again. All the polished performance Brittany's world demanded from him had vanished overnight. Now he was just my son, standing barefoot emotionally in the wreckage of his own choices. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Then Ethan's face crumpled completely. "I'm sorry." The words shattered something inside me instantly. Not because they fixed anything, they didn't, but because they were real. No rehearsed politeness, no excuses, no misunderstandings, just remorse. Ethan lowered his head suddenly, like he couldn't even bear looking at me. "I'm so sorry." I stepped aside silently. "Come inside." He entered the house, slowly glancing around the familiar hallway like someone returning to a place they no longer deserved. His childhood photographs still lined the walls. Soccer trophies still sat on the bookshelf. The same home he pushed away, trying to become someone else. I led him into the kitchen. Without thinking, I poured coffee for both of us. Motherhood again. Habit surviving heartbreak. Ethan wrapped shaking hands around the mug, but didn't drink. For several moments, the room stayed silent except for the ticking clock. Then finally, he spoke. "I didn't know." I looked at him carefully. "What exactly didn't you know?" His face twisted painfully. "Any of it." His voice cracked. "The contracts, the resort, Victor's plans, Brittany knowing about the trust." He stopped speaking and covered his face briefly. "I swear to God, Mom, I didn't know." I believed him. That was the tragedy. Ethan wasn't a mastermind. He was a weak man, desperate to be loved by the wrong people. And weak people often become dangerous without meaning to. "You still hurt me," I said quietly. His eyes filled immediately. "I know." "No." I continued softly. "I don't think you do." Ethan flinched. Good, because pain was finally reaching him. I folded my hands carefully on the table. "You asked me not to attend your wedding." Tears slid down his face instantly. "I know. You told people I was sick." He looked physically ill hearing it repeated aloud. "I know. You let another family decide whether your own mother belonged beside you." Ethan pressed trembling hands against his eyes. "I know," he whispered again, broken now. The kitchen fell silent. For the first time since Daniel died, I saw my son truly ashamed of himself. Not embarrassed, not defensive, ashamed. There's a difference. Embarrassment fears public opinion. Shame recognizes personal failure. Ethan finally looked up at me through tears. "She said you made things emotionally messy." I stared at him quietly. "I know." "No," he said hoarsely. "I mean, she said it like you loving me was inconvenient." My throat tightened painfully. "And what did you say?" Ethan looked away immediately. At first, nothing. That answer hurt, but honesty matters more than comfort. Then he continued. "But after everything came out, I realized something." I waited silently. "She never once asked how I felt about excluding you." His voice cracked again. "She only cared whether you'd interfere. Interfere. Not attend. Not celebrate. Interfere." I looked down at my wedding ring resting beside the sugar bowl. Daniel would have hated all of this. Not because of the money. Because family loyalty meant everything to him. Ethan stared at the table miserably. "I became someone Dad would have despised." "No," I said quietly. He looked up startled. "You became someone afraid." That landed harder than yelling ever could have. Because it was true. Ethan wasn't evil. He was cowardly. And cowardice destroys relationships just as effectively as cruelty. He swallowed hard. "I thought if I kept everyone happy, eventually things would settle down." I almost smiled sadly. "That's not how manipulation works, Ethan." Silence again. Then quietly he asked, "Did you know all along?" "Not all along." "When did you figure it out?" "The day of your wedding." His face twisted with fresh guilt hearing that. My God. I watched him carefully for a moment before asking the question that mattered most. "Why didn't you stop it when Brittany started disrespecting me?" Ethan looked devastated. I kept telling myself it wasn't serious, but it was. "Yes. You heard her insult me before." Another pause. "Yes. And you stayed silent." His breathing grew uneven. "Yes." There it was. The real betrayal. Not the wedding. The silence. Because love without protection eventually becomes meaningless. Tears slid down Ethan's face freely now. I don't know how to fix this. For several seconds, I simply looked at him. My son. My only child. Broken by his own choices. And despite everything, I still loved him. But love changes as you age. At 25, love means sacrifice. At 67, love finally learns boundaries. You don't fix this overnight, I said softly. Ethan nodded miserably. I know. No, I corrected gently. I don't think you do yet. He looked up slowly. Then I said the hardest thing I've ever said to my child. I forgive you, Ethan. Relief flooded his face instantly until I continued. But forgiveness does not erase consequences. The relief disappeared immediately. Good, because accountability matters. I leaned forward slightly. You humiliated me. You allowed people to use you. And worst of all, you abandoned your own judgment because you were afraid of losing approval. Ethan lowered his eyes again. You need to understand why you became willing to do that. He nodded silently. And I will not rescue you from the legal or financial mess connected to this situation. His head lifted slightly in surprise, not because he expected money, because he suddenly realized I meant it. I need you to stand on your own now, I said quietly. The room stayed silent for a long time. Then finally Ethan whispered, I don't deserve you. Tears filled my eyes again. No, I said softly, but you're still my son, and somehow that was both the punishment and the mercy. The hardest part about rebuilding trust is that love alone isn't enough. People think forgiveness instantly repairs relationships. It doesn't. Forgiveness simply means you stop feeding the wound. Healing still takes work, and consequences still remain. Ethan stayed in Savannah for 3 days after the wedding collapsed. Not at my house. That surprised him. The morning after our conversation in the kitchen, he quietly asked, Can I stay here for a while? I looked at my son carefully before answering. Every instinct inside me wanted to say yes immediately. I wanted to feed him soup, put fresh blankets on the guest bed, and protect him from the humiliation swallowing his life whole. But protecting him was part of what created this version of him in the first place. So instead I said gently, No. The word visibly hurt him. Good. Not because I wanted revenge, because Ethan needed to understand something important. Love without boundaries becomes permission. I don't understand, he whispered. You will, I said softly. I explained that he needed space to sit with the consequences of his choices without immediately retreating into the comfort I'd always provided. That doesn't mean I don't love you, I told him. Then why does this feel like punishment? Because it was. Not cruelty, not abandonment. Correction. There's a difference older women understand better than younger ones. Sometimes helping someone grow requires allowing discomfort. Ethan eventually rented a room at a small inn near River Street while dealing with the legal fallout from the canceled wedding. And there was fallout, a lot of it. By the end of that week, Rachel confirmed several financial agreements Victor Sinclair pushed Ethan into were legally questionable. Fortunately, most hadn't finalized fully because ownership verification problems froze the negotiations before completion. But Ethan still faced exposure tied to cyanide guarantees and preliminary liability clauses. Translation. The mess was expensive, emotionally and financially. One evening, Ethan came by unexpectedly around sunset while I watered flowers on the porch. He looked exhausted, not physically this time, emotionally stripped bare, like someone who finally understood how fragile identity becomes once illusions disappear. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I nodded toward the porch swing. We sat side by side, listening to cicadas hum through the warm evening air. For several minutes, Ethan simply stared at the street. Then finally he said, Brittany called again today. I kept my voice neutral. What did she want? To explain. I almost smiled sadly. Explanations arrive very quickly once consequences appear. And Ethan rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. She says her father manipulated the situation. That sounded believable. Victor absolutely manipulated the situation, but manipulation only succeeds when people willingly ignore warning signs. What do you think? I asked. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, I think she loved what my life could become more than she loved me. The honesty in that sentence made my chest ache, because heartbreak matures people quickly, especially the kind that attacks your self-worth. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. Ethan looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You tried to warn me. I tried to protect you, and I treated you like an obstacle." Neither of us spoke after that. The truth didn't need decoration anymore. Finally, Ethan whispered, "How did I become that person?" I leaned back slowly against the porch swing. Fear changes people. He frowned slightly. "I wasn't afraid." "Yes, you were." He looked confused. "You were afraid Brittany would leave if you disappointed her. Afraid her family would think you weren't sophisticated enough. Afraid your background embarrassed them." Ethan stared at the porch floor silently. Then eventually, "Maybe," I continued gently. "And fear makes people betray themselves long before they betray others." That landed hard. I could see it in his face, because Ethan finally understood something devastating. Every time Brittany insulted me and he stayed silent, he was teaching himself to abandon his own instincts. Weakness becomes habit if practiced long enough. The evening breeze lifted softly through the oak trees around us. Then Ethan asked something unexpected. "Did Dad ever feel like this?" I smiled faintly. "Your father?" He nodded, like he wasn't enough. I actually laughed softly at that. "Oh, Ethan, your father spent half his life convinced he wasn't polished enough for wealthy investors." Ethan looked startled. "What?" "Daniel grew up poor in Alabama. First person in his family to attend college. He used to mispronounce expensive wine names at business dinners on purpose just to make himself less nervous." That earned the smallest smile I'd seen from Ethan in days. "But you know the difference," I asked. "What your father never pretended to be someone else to earn respect." The smile faded slowly, because he understood exactly what I meant. Ethan looked out toward the street again. "I think Brittany hated that I still needed you." That sentence surprised me. I turned toward him carefully. "What do you mean?" "She used to say things like..." He hesitated. "A grown man shouldn't rely on his mother emotionally." Pain tightened quietly in my chest. Not because Brittany wanted independence, because she viewed emotional closeness as weakness. "And what did you think?" At first, Ethan swallowed hard. I thought maybe she was right. I nodded slowly. "There's a difference between dependence and connection." He looked at me silently. "Healthy people don't force you to abandon love in order to prove adulthood." The porch fell quiet again. Then Ethan admitted something that shattered me more than the wedding itself ever had. "The night I told you not to come." His voice cracked. I almost turned around 3 times driving here. I closed my eyes briefly. "I kept thinking about Dad," he whispered. "I kept hearing him say, 'Family comes first.'" Tears burned behind my eyes instantly. "But you still came inside and said it anyway," I replied softly. "Yes." Why Ethan's face twisted painfully. "Because I thought losing Brittany would destroy my future." I looked at him carefully. "And now..." He gave a broken little laugh. "Turns out betraying myself destroyed it faster." For the first time since the wedding, I saw real maturity flicker across my son's face. Painful maturity. The kind born from humiliation and accountability instead of comfort. That mattered. Not apologies alone. Growth. Real growth. After a long silence, Ethan finally asked, "What happens now?" I answered honestly, "That depends on what kind of man you decide to become after this." He nodded slowly. "I want to fix things. You can't erase what happened. I know. But you can become someone who would never repeat it." Ethan stared ahead quietly. Then, after a long pause, "I think I need help." The admission nearly made me cry, because older generations were taught to hide emotional weakness, men especially. Daniel probably would have rather wrestle a bear than admit he needed therapy. But Ethan sat beside me, willingly saying the words out loud. "What kind of help?" I asked gently. He looked embarrassed. "I think I need to figure out why I became so desperate for approval." The honesty of that sentence healed something inside me a little. Not fully, but a little. I reached over then and touched his hand for the first time since the wedding. "I think that's the bravest thing you've said in years." Tears filled his eyes instantly. Not dramatic tears, quiet ones. The kind grown men cry when they finally stop pretending. We sat there together until the porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, and for the first time since Ethan asked me not to come to his wedding, I saw the possibility that maybe I hadn't lost my son forever. Maybe he had simply lost himself for a while, and maybe now he was finally trying to find his way back. The next few months were uncomfortable for everyone, as they should have been. Real change rarely arrives wrapped in inspirational music and dramatic speeches. Most of the time, growth looks ugly in the beginning. Messy, humbling, quiet. Ethan started therapy 3 weeks after the wedding collapsed. I know because he told me himself one Sunday evening while washing dishes in my kitchen. Not because I asked him to, because he wanted me to know he was taking responsibility. That mattered more than any apology. I almost canceled twice, he admitted while drying plates beside me. Why? He gave a humorless laugh. Because talking honestly about yourself is terrifying. I smiled faintly. Yes, it is. The therapist apparently asked Ethan a question during one of his early sessions that left him shaken for days. What are you so afraid people will see if you disappoint them? When Ethan told me that question, he stared at the floor afterward for nearly a full minute before quietly saying, I think I spent my entire adult life trying to become someone impossible. That sentence stayed with me, because I understood exactly what he meant. America teaches people strange things about success, especially men, especially ambitious men trying to rise into wealthier social circles. Somewhere along the way, Ethan started believing love had to be earned through perfection. Perfect career, perfect image, perfect partner, perfect life. And Brittany's world fed that insecurity constantly. By November, legal investigations into Victor Sinclair's business dealings became more serious. Rachel discovered multiple questionable financial practices tied to development proposals connected to Sinclair Cove. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough for attorneys and investors to begin pulling away carefully. Victor responded exactly the way manipulative men usually do when exposed. He blamed everyone else, especially Ethan. He says you misrepresented yourself, Rachel informed Ethan during a meeting at her office. Ethan actually laughed bitterly, hearing that. Misrepresented myself as what his future bank account, Rachel almost smiled. That's essentially his argument. The saddest part, 6 months earlier, Ethan probably would have defended Victor automatically. Now he simply looked tired. Tired of manipulation. Tired of performance. Tired of confusing approval with love. Meanwhile, Brittany continued trying to contact him constantly. Calls, emails, messages, some emotional, some angry, some manipulative enough to make my skin crawl. One evening, Ethan came by, carrying his laptop, and quietly asked, "Can I show you something?" We sat together at the kitchen table while he opened an email from Brittany. At first glance, it sounded remorseful. I never meant for things to go this far. I was under pressure from my father. I still love you. But then the message shifted subtly. You know how important image is in my world. You could have handled everything more calmly. We both made mistakes. I looked up slowly. She still doesn't understand, I said. Ethan nodded miserably. She keeps talking about the embarrassment, not the betrayal. Yes, that was the fundamental difference between guilt and regret. Brittany regretted consequences. Ethan felt guilt, and only one of those emotions leads to growth. By December, Ethan made another difficult decision. He sold the luxury condo he had purchased while dating Brittany. Not because he absolutely had to financially, because he no longer wanted to live inside a life built around pretending. I bought that place because Brittany said successful architects should live somewhere impressive, he admitted, while helping me decorate the Christmas tree. I paused mid-ornament. What did you want? He looked around my living room quietly. Honestly? Yes. A home that actually felt peaceful. My chest tightened, hearing that, because people lose themselves slowly. One compromise at a time, one silence at a time, one swallowed discomfort at a time. Until suddenly they wake up living someone else's dream instead of their own life. Christmas that year felt strange. Not ruined, just fragile, different. Ethan spent Christmas Eve at my house for the first time in years. We baked pecan pie together while old jazz records played softly through the kitchen. At one point, he stopped stirring batter and looked at me carefully. You know what hurts most? What I almost missed all this permanently. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat, because he was right. If Victor's plans had succeeded, if the marriage happened smoothly, if the truth stayed hidden, I probably would have faded slowly into the background of Ethan's life until I became little more than an obligation visited on holidays. That realization hurt more than the wedding itself ever did. But I didn't say that aloud. Some truths don't need sharpening. They already cut deeply enough. Instead, I simply said, "You're here now." Ethan nodded quietly. Then, after a long silence, I still hate who I became. I turned toward him carefully. "You should." He looked startled. I continued softly. "Shame is painful for a reason. It forces us to confront ourselves honestly." The room stayed silent, except for soft Christmas music humming from the radio. Then I walked closer and touched his arm gently. "But shame should teach you, not define you." That sentence nearly broke him. I saw tears immediately fill his eyes, because older generations rarely say things like that aloud. We were raised on toughness, silence, endurance. But emotional honesty heals things pride never can. In January, Ethan started volunteering with a local housing nonprofit that renovated homes for low-income families. At first, I assumed it was guilt. Maybe partly it was. But over time, I noticed something else happening. He smiled differently there. Not the polished, professional smile he wore around Brittany's social circle. A real smile. One afternoon, I visited a renovation site unexpectedly and found Ethan kneeling beside an elderly man explaining floor plans while laughing about crooked measurements. Dust covered his jeans, paint streaked his arms, and for the first time in years, he looked like Daniel. Not physically, spiritually, grounded, kind, present. That evening over dinner, I told him so. "You reminded me of your father today." Ethan stared down at his plate quietly. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in months." "It's also a responsibility," I said gently. He nodded immediately. "I know." And I believed him. That was the important part. Not perfection, not dramatic redemption. Consistency. Real growth is repetitive, quiet, sometimes boring. It's showing up honestly even when nobody applauds you for it. By February, Ethan had become almost painfully self-aware, sometimes too aware. One afternoon, he admitted during coffee, "I keep replaying the moment I asked you not to come." I looked at him carefully. "What do you feel when you remember it?" He swallowed hard, like I betrayed the safest person I ever had. Tears filled my eyes instantly, not because the words erased pain, because they acknowledged it fully. That mattered, more than people realize. Then Ethan asked softly, "Do you think you'll ever completely trust me again?" The question lingered between us for a long moment. Finally, I answered honestly. "Trust doesn't return all at once." He nodded slowly. I figured. But I continued gently. "I think you're finally becoming someone worth trusting again." His eyes immediately filled with tears. And in that moment, I realized something important. The wedding didn't destroy my son. It exposed him. And once exposed, Ethan finally had the choice to become either bitter or better. Thankfully, he chose better. Spring arrived quietly in Savannah. The oak trees filled with green again. Tourists crowded River Street carrying iced coffees and cameras. The air smelled like jasmine after rain. And somehow life kept moving. That surprised me at first. After everything that happened, part of me expected the world to remain frozen in grief permanently. But healing doesn't usually announce itself dramatically. It slips in slowly through ordinary moments. A peaceful cup of coffee. A phone call that no longer hurts. A laugh that doesn't feel forced. By March, Ethan had settled into a smaller apartment near Forsyth Park. Nothing flashy, nothing performative, just clean, quiet, and honest. The first time I visited, I noticed something immediately. No giant abstract artwork chosen to impress guests. No designer furniture Brittany insisted serious professionals needed. No cold perfection. Instead, there were books everywhere. Sketches pinned to walls. Jazz records stacked near the window. It looked like Ethan again, not the version built for approval. The real one. "You seem lighter here," I told him while he made coffee. He smiled faintly. "I can breathe here." That sentence alone told me how trapped he'd felt before. Therapy continued helping him unpack things I don't think he'd ever admitted even to himself. Fear of disappointing people, fear of rejection, fear of seeming ordinary. One afternoon, he confessed something that stunned me. I used to rehearse conversations with Brittany before social events. I blinked. What do you mean she'd correct how I spoke sometimes? My stomach tightened instantly. What? He gave an embarrassed laugh. She said my southern habits sounded too informal around investors. Anger flared hot inside me hearing that, not because of accents. Because slowly, piece by piece, Ethan had been taught that authenticity made him less valuable. What did you do? I asked carefully. At first I thought she was helping me improve. He looked away quietly. Then eventually I stopped noticing how much of myself I was editing. That sentence haunted me for days afterward, because so many people do exactly that in relationships, not just romantic ones, friendships, workplaces, families. They shrink themselves little by little for acceptance until they barely recognize who they became. Meanwhile, Victor Sinclair's problems worsened publicly. Several investors backed away from projects after legal reviews uncovered inconsistencies tied to proposed developments. Rumors spread quickly through Charleston business circles. Victor responded by blaming Ethan openly. According to Rachel, he even suggested Ethan cause the wedding collapse because he was emotionally unstable. When Ethan told me that over Sunday dinner, I waited for anger. Instead, he just looked tired. A year ago, that accusation would have destroyed me, he admitted. And now, he shrugged softly. Now I know manipulative people attack your character when they lose control. I stared at him quietly after that. Growth sounds simple when written in self-help books. In real life, it sounds like that. Clear, calm, earned painfully. Brittany eventually stopped calling. Not dramatically. Not with closure or apology. She simply disappeared once it became obvious Ethan wouldn't return to the version of himself she preferred. Oddly enough, that hurt him too. Not because he wanted her back, because it confirmed everything. People who love you stay when things become inconvenient. People who love your potential leave when benefits disappear. By early summer, Ethan had rebuilt parts of his architecture career independently. Smaller projects, honest clients, less prestige perhaps, but more peace. One Saturday morning, he invited me to visit a community housing project his nonprofit team completed. The houses weren't glamorous. Simple structures, affordable family homes with gardens and wide porches. But watching Ethan walk through those streets explaining designs to working-class families with genuine enthusiasm made something inside me ache with pride. Not pride in success, pride in character. A little girl tugged Ethan's sleeve at one point and asked if he designed the playground too. He crouched beside her, smiling. Part of it. Well, she announced seriously, it's the best one. Ethan laughed so warmly it nearly brought tears to my eyes. That laugh used to disappear around Brittany's world. Everything there sounded measured, careful. Now he laughed freely again. After the tour, we sat together on a park bench, watching children run through sprinklers nearby. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan said, I think losing the wedding saved me. I turned toward him slowly. That's a painful sentence. It's true, though. He stared ahead quietly. If we'd gotten married, I would have spent years betraying myself trying to keep that life together. The honesty in his voice startled me. Then he added softly, and eventually I probably would have abandoned you completely. Those words hurt, even now, maybe especially now because they were true. I looked down at my hands quietly. I knew it was heading there, I admitted. Ethan's face tightened with guilt instantly. Mom, no, I interrupted gently. You should hear this. He stayed silent. I spent months grieving you before the wedding even happened. That shattered him. I saw it immediately. Because children rarely realize parents mourn emotional distance long before relationships officially break. I kept telling myself maybe it was stress, I continued softly. Maybe wedding pressure, maybe adulthood. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. But deep down I whispered, I think I knew I was slowly disappearing from your life. A tear slid down his cheek instantly. I'm sorry. I know. The park stayed quiet around us for several moments. Then Ethan asked something unexpected. Why didn't you fight harder? I frowned slightly. What do you mean? You could have exposed everything immediately. You could have shown up at the wedding and humiliated all of us. I smiled sadly, because I didn't want revenge. He looked at me carefully. Then why stay home? The answer came easily, because I finally realized I couldn't force people to value me. Emotion crossed Ethan's face instantly. I continued softly. The only thing I could control was whether I abandoned my own dignity, trying to convince people I deserved love. Tears filled his eyes again. You always deserved it. Yes, I said quietly, and eventually I remembered that. That was the real turning point in this story. Not the contracts, not the wedding collapse, not even Brittany's betrayal. The real turning point happened the moment I stopped begging emotionally for space in rooms where my presence should have been cherished automatically. Older women spend too much of life shrinking themselves to keep relationships comfortable. Staying quiet, accepting disrespect, excusing behavior, especially mothers, especially widows, especially women raised to prioritize everyone else first. But there comes a moment, if you're lucky, when you finally understand something life-changing. Love that requires humiliation is not love worth keeping. The breeze lifted softly around us, while children laughed nearby. Then Ethan reached for my hand carefully, not entitled, not expecting instant healing, just hopeful. I'm glad you stayed home, he whispered. I looked at him in surprise. He swallowed hard. Because if you had kept protecting me from consequences, I never would have become this version of myself. Tears blurred my vision instantly. And for the first time since the wedding, I realized something beautiful. Maybe losing the life Ethan thought he wanted was exactly what allowed him to become the man he was always supposed to be. Almost exactly 1 year after the wedding. That never happened. Ethan invited me back to Charleston. The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was watering herbs on my porch. Can you come to Sinclair Cove this Saturday? There's something important I need to do. No dramatic explanation, no emotional pressure, just honesty. That alone told me how much he had changed. A year earlier, Ethan would have hidden difficult conversations beneath polished language and careful image management. Now he simply told the truth. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. What's happening there? A few minutes later, he answered. A community dedication ceremony. I want you there this time. Something tightened quietly in my chest, reading those words. This time, I agreed to come. Saturday morning arrived warm and bright, the kind of Carolina coastal day that smells like salt water and sunlight. I drove to Charleston alone with the windows down and old jazz music playing softly through the car speakers. Strangely, I wasn't nervous. 1 year earlier, that road carried me toward heartbreak. Now it carried me toward closure. As Sinclair Cove came into view beside the ocean, memories flooded back immediately. The chandeliers, the white roses, the ballroom where my absence once became the loudest thing in the room. But the atmosphere felt completely different now. No luxury spectacle, no designer wedding displays. Instead, tents lined the waterfront beside newly completed affordable housing units Ethan's nonprofit helped design. Through partnerships connected to the Patterson Trust, families walked around carrying lemonade and folding chairs. Children ran near the dunes laughing. Everything felt real, human, alive. I parked slowly and stepped out into the warm ocean breeze. For a moment, I simply stood there, staring at the property Daniel once purchased quietly all those years ago. Funny how life works. The same place that almost destroyed my relationship with my son somehow became the place where we rebuilt it. Mom. I turned immediately. Ethan walked toward me wearing khaki pants and a simple blue button-down shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. No expensive suit, no performance. Just Ethan. He looked older than he had a year ago. Not physically, emotionally, more grounded, more honest, more peaceful. And when he reached me, he hugged me immediately. Not quickly, not awkwardly, fully, like a son finally understood what family actually meant. You came, he said softly. Of course I came. Emotion flickered across his face instantly. Then he smiled nervously. There's a lot of people here, I noticed. That's actually why I wanted you here. I looked at him curiously. Before he could explain further, Rachel Bennett appeared carrying iced teacups. Well, she announced dramatically, look at this emotionally healthy reunion. I laughed for the first time that morning. Rachel hugged me tightly before glancing toward Ethan. You ready? He nodded slowly. That nervousness caught my attention immediately. What's going on? Ethan exhaled carefully. There's going to be a short speech. Ah, now I understood. We walked together toward a small stage set up near the waterfront. Around 200 people sat facing the Ocean Breeze community leaders, local families, nonprofit workers, architects, and Charleston residents involved in the housing project. Nothing flashy, nothing performative, just meaningful. As the ceremony began, several speakers talked briefly about affordable housing initiatives and community restoration projects. Ethan stood quietly beside the stage the entire time, looking increasingly anxious. Then finally, the organizer smiled toward him. And now the man who helped lead this project from design to completion, Ethan Patterson. Applause rose warmly around us. Ethan walked onto the stage, slowly holding folded note cards in trembling hands. And suddenly, unexpectedly, I remembered him at 8 years old, standing in a school auditorium, terrified to perform in a Christmas play. Back then, Daniel squeezed his shoulder and whispered, "Just tell the truth, son. People trust truth." Ethan looked out at the audience silently for several seconds. Then he found me sitting near the front row, and I saw it happen. The fear softened. He began speaking. When people talk about rebuilding communities, he said quietly, they usually talk about buildings first. His voice steadied gradually. But honestly, buildings are the easy part. A few soft laughs moved through the crowd. The harder part is rebuilding people after they lose themselves. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Ethan glanced down briefly at his notes before continuing. A year ago, I stood on this property during what was supposed to be my wedding day. Murmurs moved lightly through the audience. Many local people already knew parts of the story from gossip and news surrounding Victor Sinclair's legal issues. Ethan continued anyway. At the time, I thought success meant impressing the right people. I thought love meant earning approval. And worst of all, his voice cracked slightly. I believed protecting appearances mattered more than protecting the people who truly loved me. Silence settled across the waterfront. Ocean waves crashed softly behind him. Then Ethan looked directly at me. 1 year ago, I told the most important person in my life not to come here. Tears instantly filled my eyes. The audience stayed completely still. My mother spent her entire life loving me, he continued softly, and I repaid that love with embarrassment, silence, and cowardice. Emotion shook visibly through his voice now. But when everything collapsed, she still gave me the opportunity to become a better man instead of a bitter one. I covered my mouth with trembling fingers, not because I needed public apology, because I finally understood something important. Ethan truly saw me now, not as obligation, not as background, not as emotionally messy, as family, real family. He swallowed hard before continuing. This housing project exists because my mother taught me something I almost forgot. He paused briefly. That dignity matters more than status, and that love without respect eventually becomes empty. By then, tears blurred my vision completely. The audience applauded softly, emotionally, but Ethan wasn't finished. He looked at me one final time. "Mom," he said quietly into the microphone, "thank you for staying home that day." A stunned little laugh escaped me through tears. Then Ethan smiled sadly. Because losing your approval forced me to finally confront myself honestly. The applause afterward felt warm and genuine, but honestly, I barely heard it. I only saw my son. Not perfect, not flawless, just finally whole. After the ceremony ended, Ethan walked straight toward me through the crowd. Neither of us spoke at first. We simply stood there crying and laughing softly at the same time while ocean wind moved around us. Then finally he whispered, "I love you." Simple words, but this time they carried weight. Truth, maturity, choice. I touched his face gently the same way I used to when he was little. "I love you too." And for the first time in years, those words no longer felt painful. As the sun began lowering over the Charleston coastline, I stood beside my son, watching families explore the new homes built on Patterson land. Children laughing, people talking, Life moving forward. 1 year earlier, I thought staying home meant losing everything. But standing there beside Ethan, I finally understood the truth. Sometimes staying home is the loudest way a woman reclaims her worth, and sometimes the people who truly love you eventually find their way back once you stop abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak in life does not come from strangers. It comes from the people we loved so completely that we never imagined they could hurt us. As parents, especially as mothers, we are often taught to sacrifice endlessly to stay quiet, forgive quickly, and keep giving love, even when it costs us our dignity. But this story reminds us of something powerful. Love should never require humiliation. Andrea's pain was not just about being excluded from a wedding. It was about slowly disappearing in the eyes of someone she spent her entire life protecting. And yet the most important lesson is that she did not destroy herself trying to force her son to value her. She chose silence over chaos, boundaries over begging, self-respect over emotional desperation. That choice changed everything. Many people believe boundaries push loved ones away, but healthy boundaries often reveal who truly loves us and who only loves the version of us that is easy to control. Andrea's decision to stay home forced Ethan to confront truths he had spent months avoiding. And because she stopped protecting him from consequences, he finally had the opportunity to become a better man. That is what real love sometimes looks like. Not rescuing people from every painful lesson, but loving them enough to let them face themselves honestly. This story is also a reminder that it is never too late for people to grow. Ethan failed badly. He hurt the person who loved him most, but accountability, humility, and sincere change gave him a path back to himself. Healing did not happen overnight. Trust did not magically return. But little by little, truth rebuilt what pride had destroyed, and maybe that is the real message here. The people who truly belong in your life will eventually recognize your value once you stop abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your peace and protecting a relationship? What would you have done if you were Andrea? And if you enjoy emotional family stories with deep life lessons like this one, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. Your support means more than you know.